Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Alistair.
And I'm Nick.
And in today's episode, we will be hunting for Russian spies in the home counties, in Slow Horses, and then contemplating our fear of death in White Noise. But before all of that, Nick, what have you been up to recently?
Well, in some ways, I'm covering something we've already covered before, but in other ways, I'm not, because I've been watching the American version of Ghosts on iPlayer. This is, of course, the US adaptation of the acclaimed British sitcom about a couple who move into a very haunted house, and wacky antics ensue, with a cast of ghosts from different eras all harassing the one member of the couple who can see them, who this time is played by Rose McIver of iZombie fame, with her husband played by Utkarsh Ambudkar. So yeah, I have seen about 2/3 of the first season of this American sitcom. It's long seasons, guys, I'm getting through it. And yeah, it's odd. It's like almost every sitcom, to be fair, it takes at least a few episodes to settle down. Especially, I feel, the character of the husband, I think, is written maybe as a slightly more of a sort of cocksure bro in the first few episodes, before they settle into him being a bit more of a sort of skittish, bumbling nerd in a similar way to the UK sitcom character Mike. I think it's enjoyable. I think it's finding its feet. The interesting part about it, I guess, is as it goes on, the way it seems to be differing from the UK version is that it's a bit more interested in playing with the premise and the supernatural rules and so on. Like, there's a bit in the first season. I'm only 2/3 through the first season, but they've already had an episode where the ghosts learn to possess someone, and an episode where Sam goes to the place her mother dies to see if she can see her ghost. So it's a lot of sort of wider world stuff, whereas the UK version is just mostly sort of character-based comedy in this house. The US version is perhaps thinking a bit more, what are the implications of this? What can their powers really do? Partly maybe it's the budget, the fact they've got more money, partly maybe it's the fact they've got longer seasons to fill. Like, you know, I think this show is about halfway through its second season in America right now, so that means it's probably already, or very close to already, made more episodes than the UK version has in like 4 seasons. You know, they get through a lot of material. So yeah, it's interesting. I think my well-known patriotic national spirit compels me to say that the UK version is probably a better show, but it's interesting, and the more it distinguishes itself from the UK version, the more interesting it becomes. And yes, it is actually funny as well. The jokes are a bit more on the nose and telegraphed, maybe, than the UK version. But like a lot of US shows, I think, a lot of its appeal is almost less in its comic ingenuity and more in just how it's just quite nice, you know? The characters are all quite likeable, you kind of want them to do well.
That sounds good. Yeah, I mean, I've been really intrigued by this American version and to see kind of how it's similar, how it's different. My partner has just been diving into it partly because she was on a very long flight recently and it was all provided by the in-flight entertainment. What she said was that the characters are quite different. They're not necessarily direct analogues for all of them. Right, Julian is not a politician anymore. He's a sort of a Wall Street guy, and some of the other characters from the British one don't have an exact copies in the American one.
Yeah, they've sort of mixed up the sort of historical things they've gone for. Like, honestly, one of the only characters who has been more or less copied across directly with very few real changes is the character Pat from the UK version, who is now Pete, the sort of cheerful scout troop leader with the arrow through his neck. He is here representing the UK show by basically being a straight transposition from one to the other. But the other characters have been changed around a bit, maybe partly to mix up the ensemble, partly because obviously there's a different history in the US. Oh, there is the uptight lady who owned the manor is still here as well, actually. To be fair, that character has also survived relatively unscathed. A bit more is made of the fact that she's a distant relative of the lead character. There's a bit of a sort of surrogate mother thing going on with her sometimes.
Is she a sort of Scarlett O'Hara southern lady type? Or?
No, she's a sort of uptight country lady in a big dress who finds everything quite distasteful. It's relatively similar to the UK version. She's maybe not quite as uptight because, you know, yeah, the Americans like to think they're more loose. But yeah, it's quite similar.
Yeah, and I think the World War II soldier has been transposed to be a Civil War soldier and things like that.
Yeah, there's a bit about him being jealous of the more famous Alexander Hamilton.
Now that sounds at least topical. Things like that, yeah.
Yeah. He's got a musical, etc.
Yeah, it's interesting to, I guess, see how, like, I guess they've interpreted the humour differently, and that the American one, I guess they feel the need to put in more plot, or, like, I guess even to throw in more things as sources of humour, whereas the British one is very reliant on, like a lot of British sitcoms, from, I don't know, Peep Show to Space, to basically, these characters are in a small space and they just interact with each other, and that is the source of humour. We don't need to come up with too much on top of that.
There's always a certain amount of that, because, you know, that's why the American sitcom is such a classic because you can get huge amounts of episodes out of just sitting in the same space. I mean, in the 9 seasons of The Office, they did do quite a lot of sitting around in that office. And, a lot of the episodes are just set entirely in the house. But there's a bit more extension. There's a bit more, as I say, there's some episodes where they leave the house, but the thing they do more often is play with, what it means to be a ghost. Like, every ghost's superpower is kind of revealed, and it's a whole, it's a different thing which somehow affects their character or is just a silly joke. And as I say, they've done possession. Yeah, they seem a bit more interested in the mythology, whereas the UK show, I mean, a couple of them have, like, mild abilities, but they don't seem as fascinated by them as the US version does.
The casting sounds very good, especially the woman who played the protagonist in iZombie. She was excellent. I can imagine she'd be good in this.
Yeah, she's once again playing the sort of every woman in the face of the supernatural thing. I don't know if this counts as being typecast. At least she doesn't have to do it under like massively heavy makeup this time, I suppose.
Yeah. What's interesting also is that in the last week I've been rewatching the original Ghosts a bit after a visit to my parents where I introduced my dad to it because I thought it would be funny. So we showed him the first 2 episodes of the first season, the British show, which obviously form a kind of neat arc setting up the premise. And, I'd forgotten basically from the beginning, like, how tight it is with like how much they cram into like the first few episodes, setting everything up, introducing all the characters, the dynamic, kind of getting the people in the position that they will be in for like kind of the rest of it. And also just how much humour there is from like the beginning, such as like little bits like Mike not being able to fix the boiler but thinks he can, or like just like accidentally smashing a hole in the wall. Things like that are just like, hilarious, just how funny it is right from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, American episodes are only 20 minutes, so sometimes you get the feeling they're struggling a bit, actually, with the cramming. Like, a lot of episodes, especially if they've got, like, a guest star on or something, a couple of the ghosts that are sort of conspicuously missing, just to, I guess, free up a bit of space. Whereas one of the impressive things about the UK one, because they've got the whole half hour, is that they do often, I think in most episodes, I haven't sat down and measured it, manage to give every ghost something to do, even though there's, like, 7 or 8 of them.
Yeah, they've all got some kind of plot line, even if it's just, like, they want something but can't have it. But then usually that ghost either getting what they want or not getting what they want will also chime into like the main plot line at some point. I mean, it is incredibly tightly written how the fact that like it all comes together, in the conclusion, weaving in, like 10 characters into the climax each time, and they do it almost every episode. It's why it's such a good show.
Yeah, with the US one, it's a bit more maybe like you'd expect. There's a couple of ghosts who have like a storyline, and the rest are just there to sort of comically bicker in the background a lot of the time. But yeah, it's fun, as I say. A lot of the niceness of it is in the sort of it feels nice basic warmth, and every so often they do get off a really, really good joke, so fair enough. It's an enjoyable show. I wouldn't replace the UK version with it, but so far it's an interesting supplement. I wait with interest to see if in like 6 years' time, like happens with The Office, this show is seen as like a widely regarded classic.
Yeah, it may be one that builds momentum as it goes, but yeah. Is it one for fans of the British show wanting more?
Probably, yeah. I think it's definitely interesting as a comparison point. I mean, I'm sure there are some people who correctly think the UK show is great and just find this to be such a paler reputation they can't stand it. But yeah, for the record, it probably picks up heavily, I'd say, around episode 4 or 5. There's a few episodes of sort of finding itself, but it gets itself together. By about halfway through the season, I'd say it's doing pretty well. So there you go. Want to join me in this experiment? Go ahead. Alistair, what have you consumed in the last fortnight, apart from the first 2 episodes of UK Ghosts?
Well, I've been trying to get through basically all the TV that I was supposed to watch in 2022 that I didn't in time. Tick various things off before we obviously get started on the 2023 schedule. So yeah, finished off House of the Dragon, a few things like that. Obviously Slow Horses that we'll come to. But one other thing that has been on my to-watch list from last year, there was a lot of good buzz around, is the show Cyberpunk Edge Runners, which is a Netflix anime show based in the world of the Cyberpunk 2077, which is it's a video game that's also based on an older role-playing game. But yeah, don't let that put you off or whatever. If you've not played the video game or the role-playing game, you don't really need to be familiar with that to understand the show, because it kind of just introduces you with everything that you want. This is a sort of classic slice of cyberpunk literature. It's high-tech, low-life. It's about a teenage boy who, I don't know, is a bit sort of lazy at school, and he's in a sort of dystopian, tech-heavy future universe, and his mum, who's a paramedic, is killed, and he, through some sort of slightly shady means, comes across some sort of military enhancement cyber gear that he, in a fit of pique, has inserted into his spine, and then embarks on a life as a sort of G'd up cyber criminal. and then he falls in with a group of other criminals and quite violent mayhem ensues. And yeah, but this show, although, I don't know, you're probably thinking that like this sounds like the sort of thing that fairly standard fare kind of, like teenage tearaway kind of embarks on criminal career, this time with sort of cybernetic enhanced superpowers. But there is something really compelling about the show. There's a lot of unusual twists, like although it might seem on the surface a fairly generic story, but there is actually a lot of interesting stuff in the how it's executed. It goes in some unexpected directions. There's some good twists. There's a good sort of supporting cast of characters. So actually, yeah, I really enjoyed this.
Okay, so this isn't a spin-off of something else, or it is, but you don't need to have seen that.
Yeah, well, I think, similar probably to Arcane. It's probably the best example, as they're both sort of Netflix animated shows set in a wider universe about a video game. But you don't need to, I think, be familiar with it. I've, for the record, not played Cyberpunk 2077. I've fallen behind a bit in gaming because I don't really have the most recent generation of games consoles. So yeah, I haven't been able to play this. Although yeah, I've heard a lot of good stuff about it. Certainly in the cyberpunk world, it's kind of the big property in town. If you type cyberpunk into YouTube, you're mainly going to get content about Cyberpunk 2077 because it's a huge media enterprise and sort of AAA rated game. But this is just sort of standalone story about some characters, and I mean there's an element of it like the characters in the show are sort of constantly like upgrading themselves, replacing bits of their bodies with cybernetic equipment, making themselves tougher and stronger, which I assume is just sort of importing the kind of customization and leveling up mechanic from the game into, this sort of linear fictional storyline. But, you don't need to be familiar with the game or its concepts. I mean, I don't think it deals too much with stuff that it wouldn't be familiar to the average cyberpunk fan. There's a sort of a world, there's evil corporations, there's mercenaries, there's like, people using military hardware to enhance themselves. It's stuff that anyone who's read much cyberpunk literature or cyberpunk films or games will be familiar with, but it's very much in the execution that makes this different and interesting.
I mean, you've consumed more cyberpunk media than me, so yeah, I assume if this is actually holding your attention, there must be something to it.
Yeah. I think there's something about the characters. They go in unusual directions. There's sort of various surprises along the way. I mean, they're not above, like, for example, like, you think the group itself is established and, like, these are the characters we'll be following, and then, one of them will be sort of summarily dispatched. Again, in something that possibly, you wouldn't be expecting, like in the opening, minutes of an episode. And, that's the sort of thing that catches you off guard, when they're not, like, treating characters as, these characters are safe, nothing can happen to them. Something like that catch your attention, and also the world is sort of really beautifully brought to life through the animation and through the kind of character design. There's a sort of real rich world here. I guess probably a lot of that comes from the video game as well, but it's used well in this as a TV show.
Well, it's still possible to enjoy this stuff, as you say. We both liked Arcane perfectly fine, and I myself have never played League of Legends.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so even as just like a standalone sci-fi show, there's a lot to like here. There's a lot of like entertaining stuff, interesting characters and things like that.
So now we could just sit tight and see if Netflix cancel it after one season.
It'd be interesting to see if they do more. Like, I don't know. Again, don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't watched it and is now intrigued, because I would recommend watching this show, but I'd be surprised how they do a second series based on how it ends. Because the ending, again, there's a lot of surprises there. I mean, I guess it's a show set in the world of a video game. There's probably a lot of other characters or circumstances they could pick up if they wanted to do a second series.
I did just Google that, I will admit, to see if I could have the fitting opportunity to once again tell you on air that a show you like has been cancelled. And
it's happened before.
It does, it's fun. I enjoy it. But no, according to Wikipedia, in October 2022, they announced there would not be a second season and stated that it was intended as a standalone work. So you may be correct.
Yeah, and like I say, the ending seems pretty definitive. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that seems to have captured the attention of, I guess, any of the people I follow on Twitter and Instagram. I see a lot of people, I don't know, just really praising it, enjoying it, seem to have a bit of a moment. A lot of people who are into cosplaying have certainly got into kind of cosplaying the main woman character in it, Lucy. That seems to be a character that's sort of struck a chord with a lot of people. Again, she's a sort of a hacker and a badass woman, but there's more to her than the, tropey, strong woman sort of psychic character. There's some complexity complexity to her, and especially in the episodes that digging into her childhood and backstories. So it's one of those things that, like, it really highlights to me the idea that there are no original ideas, almost everything being done, but there is a lot of original execution out there.
Yeah, just out of interest, did you enjoy the ending of House of the Dragon?
I did enjoy the ending of House of the Dragon, especially the last episode. Again, I don't know, should we drop spoilers for House of the Dragon? It was out ages ago. When they really got into the final episodes, gearing up to all-out war between the various cadet branches of the Targaryen house. That was pretty tense.
Yeah, no, the final couple of episodes where shit kicks off, that was extremely good. I did come out of that season definitely wanting more.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
Happily, it's not made by Netflix, so there will be more.
Yeah, I did just not finish it in time. I think I only had like 1 or 2 episodes outstanding when I did the final tally of the year. Probably wouldn't have broken my top 5 of the year, but it wasn't eligible because I was still waiting to see some of it. But I don't know, now that I've mopped it up, I'm genuinely surprised that they could get people to love more Game of Thrones after how the previous series ended. And I didn't have on my 2022 bingo card, everyone's going to go back into Game of Thrones again. But yeah, House of the Dragon gets the thumbs up.
Well, they made, about 5 or 6 good seasons. That's the majority win. Okay, and first up today, it's Slow Horses, the spy thriller drama from Apple TV. This is, of course, based on the novels by Mick Herron, and this is about the spies of Slough House, the place where you go if you've fucked up, offended your superiors, or otherwise fallen into disrepute in MI5. You go to Slough House to work under the ageing, broken down drunk Jackson Lamb, played by Gary Oldman. There have now been 2 seasons, both released in the same year. I assume they were basically filmed in a single block, because I think they've now done the same for seasons 3 and 4. And we have seen them both, so we'll be gliding gloriously across the whole thing. In the second season, which ended, I think, within the last couple of weeks, the Slow Horses find themselves involved in the Cicadas, a group of undercover spies living among the population of Britain, not unlike the characters in The Americans, which I finished watching recently, and they're finally going to emerge to fuck us all over. Can our heroes handle this? Can they handle the million other things that are happening at the same time? Alistair, how did it go?
So I enjoyed this show. What's interesting about it is obviously we've had kind of MI5 shows like done to death.
By spooks, single-handedly.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. People, I was about to say, people of our generation would obviously remember glossy BBC drama spooks that seemed to want to be desperately be taken seriously, but would occasionally just sort of shoot off into mad shit, especially as it went on. So, I don't know, we've seen a lot of spy dramas and things like that, and I think what makes this one fresh and interesting is that it has a real sense of humour. I wouldn't really describe this as like a comedy. The situations are deadly serious, the characters are largely serious. It's not a spoof or a sitcom, but there is a real kind of sense of humour to it. I guess there is a sort of humorous side to the premise, which is that these people are all fuck-ups and losers in some way, and Jackson Lamb, their boss, is in some ways the biggest fuck-up and loser of them all. But it kind of really works how it will kind of use the humour alongside the tension, and when, each season's spy plot, especially the second season's one, come into fruition, it is really tense when the kind of bits come together. But there'll be a fair amount of them being rubbish spies along the way that provides you a fair amount of humour. So they've done a very good job balancing the tone for this to get it right.
Well, yeah, there's this sort of self-deprecating gallows humour to it, this sort of awareness that they're all quite low on the pecking order. Yeah, I think the lead writer of this, Will Smith, not that one, was previously best known, to me at least, as a writer and actor on The Thick of It. So there's definitely an air of Thick of It to the way they all just constantly tell each other how crap they obviously are. And, I don't know, I'm not quite going to fully defend Spooks, because it did get quite stupid at times. But it was a show I had a lot of time for during its sort of early peak years. And this show definitely has a few shades of Spooks to it. If you told me this was a new spin-off called Spooks Crap Division, then part of me would believe you, except for the part where the BBC could afford Gary Oldman. But yeah, it's got a good sense of pacing. It slots in a lot of character development without slowing down the pace. It does a very good job of that. There's always good cliffhangers. The plot is always hopping along. There's only 6 episodes a series. They're relatively brisk, sort of 40 to maybe 50-minute episodes. And yeah, it's very, very enjoyable. I gather from intelligence given to us by, I think, your partner, that these are quite close adaptations of the novels, so original author Mick Herron may well deserve a lot of the credit for the tightness of the plotting. But they've done a good job of bringing that through here. It's a really tense, exciting thriller at times, despite the frequent gallows humour.
Yeah, the buzz from not only my partner, but also from a lot of people I follow online who are fans of the books have basically said that this sticks very closely to the books, which is something that the fans really appreciate, and they haven't toned down, especially Jackson Lamb's some more pleasant bits. I mean, when I'm describing this show to people, I always kind of say, look, the first bit of the first episode in the first season is Jackson Lamb is passed out in an alcoholic stupor on his desk and then farts so loudly that he wakes himself up. And that's kind of how it begins. And that's the sort of, I don't know, I guess, kind of humour you're getting with this. Yeah, there are a lot of fart jokes and stuff, but I guess, I don't know, there's a lot of serious spy stuff as well. I mean, it reminds me of films like I, Tonya, which managed to balance, stories about serious domestic abuse with the kind of ridiculousness of celebrity culture. The humour doesn't detract from the dark aspects. The dark aspects don't detract from the humour. It's a difficult balance to strike, but they manage it here.
Because, I think fundamentally the spy building blocks are here, which I guess, again, is just a sign of how well put together the stories in the books and or TV shows are, because they can afford to play up the big character of Jackson Lamb. Yeah, played by Gary Oldman here, who is having a very good time.
Yeah, he's excellent, yeah.
He does get to sort of play this sort of anti-hero character who wears classic big beige trench coats and is always slightly ahead of everybody most of the time, and has a certain smugness and has a sort of gruffness with a very, very slight hint of a heart of gold, or at least a heart of giving a shit if his employees live or die. Yeah, it's in some ways quite a classic anti-hero character, so honestly, in many ways, the fact that he's also a slightly disgusting presence with his sort of unflattering lank haircut and, again, yes, as Alistair says, the constant farting, does almost do a lot to veil the fact, but in some ways, this is a classic sort of gruff yet lovable boss anti-hero character.
I mean, Gary Oldman is also very much here sort of riffing off, and the character, I guess, kind of exists in relation to the other very famous spy played by Gary Oldman when he played, Smiley in the film adaptation of Jean le Carré's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. And in some ways, this is sort of the anti-Smiley. Smiley was a very successful spy. He ends up being in control. Jackson Lamb is not successful. He's ended up in charge of Slough House. But again, there's a similar element. They're both very intelligent. They're always one step ahead of everyone else. They're always, entrapping people, luring them into the situations they want them to be, manipulating people, the meat and potato work of spycraft. And they're not succeeding because of gadgets or brawn. They're succeeding because of their ability to trick people and know more than anyone else. So it's kind of weird how this character is sort of very similar to Smiley, but also the opposite. The casting of Gary Oldman is very deliberate in that bit because, big fans of the spy genre will have that in their mind while watching the show.
Yeah, it does have the sort of classic spy genre move of the constant, twist or betrayal, or he's not who you thought he was, or he's working for someone else. There's a lot of that in this. There's a lot of really good twists and turns. Again, often positioned nicely on a cliffhanger. And it's very, very watchable. When I first watched season 1 of this, I had the pre-Christmas cold that was going around. So I was basically on the sofa for about 2 days, and I spent most of them watching the first 6 episodes of this, more or less chain blasting through them. And it was extremely enjoyable, apart from the constant snotting and coughing.
Yes, well, it's all about the bodily functions, isn't it, Jackson?
Yeah, I felt like I was really honouring him.
Yeah, but I mean, also similar to Spooks, which you mentioned before, I think this is really aimed at being a believable spy thing. It's, we're not in the James Bond super spying territory. This is, there's an element of you could believe that this actually happened. I mean, the first season, the villains are like a group of far-right terrorists. And you're not like a big network or something like that. Just 4 or 5 people online who've met and are now plotting like a sort of a far-right terror attack. In this one, again, it's about a small group of ex-KGB agents and also some people who are sort of in the current Russian Secret Service. So, there's no mountain volcano bases and things like that. It's all done at a level that you could believe has actually happened, and there's this kind of veneer of reality to it, which kind of, again, adds to the tension. The fact that, I could believe that these sort of things are going on, and this is sort of how the spy business operates.
There's still a level of catharsis to it, I guess. It's not as if we're talking like a really painfully slow character-based drama where you maybe get an action sequence every 1 or 2 episodes, or even every 2 or 3 episodes, which is kind of how the Americans is. Whereas Spooks and Slow Horses, most times in every episode, someone will at some point start running or fire a gun, or someone will get decapitated or shot or chucked in a river or something. Yeah. There's a reasonably good drip, drip, drip of, explosive action moments.
Yeah, which is what keeps it dramatic and things like that. I mean, also, because as you said, it's like 6 episodes a season. They're 45 minutes. It's tightly plotted. They've got a book's worth of plot to get through. So, it's well structured just on the kind of, again, like the meat and potatoes of dramatic storytelling. They always have a good end of episode cliffhanger. Yeah, there's like significant developments. I mean, in the second season, I don't know how much spoilers, but like a core cast member is dispatched and there is a general, feeling of this is significant. There's emotional weight to it. So, they've got the kind of storytelling elements down pat.
This is a bit of a sort of meta point, I guess, but I like the fact that there's only 3 people who have their names in the title sequence. If you actually watch the title sequence with interest, as I do as a TV nerd, you sort of see, who's who's got their name in the title sequence, who is therefore technically a main regular cast member and is probably slightly less likely to be killed off. And there really aren't that many. It's only Gary Oldman, the guy who plays River Cartwright, the sort of annoyingly enthusiastic wannabe James Bond kid.
Jack Lowden is the actor, isn't it?
Yeah, and Kristen Scott Thomas, who plays Jackson Lamb's sort of nemesis at the main MI5 office.
Yeah.
Most of the actual rank and file of Slough House, the actual regular spies, because there's like 5 or 6 other people who mill around in Slough House aside from Jackson Lamb and River Cartwright. And they all have like personalities and stuff. They, as I say, it's drip-fed through quite well, the characterisation. But there is a vague sense that any of them could die. Like, there are a couple of characters, in fact, I think there's at least 3 other major characters who are in it more or less beginning to end from seasons 1 and 2. But they still don't get to be in the credits, which is, maybe bad news for the actors and their agents. But it does provide a certain level of drama.
Yeah, and the other aspect is, the brief cameo twice a season from Jonathan Pryce, when he turns up because he's in the credits. But he is very good as well. But I think they've got a great cast of characters and actors. Each one of them really believe in, each one of them you're really invested in. Some of them are also quite awful people because they've done bad things and that's why they've ended up in Slough House. But none of them seem like a caricature. They all seem like a believable, real person.
Yeah, I liked, to get into the specifics of the second season, I guess, I like the fact that in the first season, the plot is kind of, standard underdoggy stuff in a way. Like, they may be losers, people may underestimate them, but they're going to show that they can still get it done. And they sort of help contribute to this big case. But in the second season, to be honest, they kind of fuck up a lot. You can see why they maybe haven't prospered in their field. There's a certain amount of the plot in the second season is driven by the slow horses of Slough House making some quite stupid decisions and being kind of bad at their jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, it makes it feel a bit different from other spy shows.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's an element of this as almost like, I don't know, making a sort of political statement or possibly, being slightly subversive in the use of how the characters fuck up, which is to say that, we sort of lionize the security service, and films like James Bond and shows like 24 do contribute to this. Obviously, the phrase that gets banded about is like cop Uganda, TV shows that basically encourage us to love the police. I guess there's a spy Uganda. Wait a minute, that sounds more like a country. Okay, well, it's a bad portmanteau.
What's going on?
I don't know, but the idea being that like shows like 24 and films like James Bond kind of encourage us to basically kind of believe in the security services and also justify that basically their kind of abuse of power and our civil rights is necessary to keep us safe. Whereas these shows kind of puncture that by showing that actually no, these people aren't sort of superhuman agents on a God-given mission to keep us safe. They're actually regular people. They fuck up. They make mistakes. Maybe they shouldn't be beyond the law or invested with extrajudicial powers because a lot of them are fuck-ups, a lot of them make mistakes. This workplace is as flawed as any other. So, maybe we shouldn't kind of put them on the pedestal that things like James Bond do.
Yeah, it's interesting because that message is in there, but at the same time they are all written as quite likeable and relatable and engaging in a way.
Yeah, it's not bitter.
Or at least relatable. Some of them are a bit deliberately caustic, like Jackson Lamb, and there's at least another character, Roddy, who is a bit of a prick.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're all written as 3-dimensional characters. So yeah, I don't know if that takes away from that message or not, in that you still come away sort of liking them and rooting for them.
Well, I think the fact that you like them and relate to them as normal people kind of actually reinforces the message, because the idea is that, spies are real people. They're just the same as us, which also means they shouldn't be put on a pedestal or given more rights or ability to avoid responsibility than normal people would be subjected to. I mean, Killing Eve kind of did this well, especially in the early seasons when they had, MI5 is just like anywhere else to work. There are people who are hungover. They have discussions in a slightly shabby canteen arguing over the last croissant. These people are normal people, but they shouldn't be given, a greater status. So the fact that they're likeable, I feel, reinforces that.
And yet, this is enjoyable TV. I'm glad they seem to have renewed it for not just a 3rd season, but also a 4th season.
Yeah, there's a lot of books and stuff, and I'm glad they're keeping it coming quickly. If anything that threatens it, it might be the fact that, according to film Twitter, which is never wrong, the current buzz is that Jack Lowden might be the frontrunner to be the next James Bond. I can see it.
I can see it because it's painfully obvious, but that seems like the sort of thing you say just because he's recently played a young, good-looking spy. I mean, who knows? It's probably now going to be true, but it also sounds like the sort of thing that the Daily Mirror would make up because he's recently played a young spy.
That is entirely true. However, I just want it on the record in case it is true.
Fair enough. If Jack Lowden turns out to be the next James Bond, and some of you may have heard it here first.
Yeah.
I certainly did.
They could do worse, I feel. They could do worse with James Bond. And also, as much as a lot of people saying they would like it to be Idris Elba, they would like it to be Michael Fassbender, it's never anyone that famous. I think as someone, again, I can't remember the actual person's Twitter handle to give them credit, but as someone said, it'll be a guy who's been in a bit of stuff, because it always is.
Well, that narrows it down. Okay, and last up today, White Noise. This is, of course, a recent comedy film written and directed by Noah Baumbach, adapted from a novel I have not read by Don DeLillo from the mid-80s. This is a film starring Adam Driver as the father of a family who go through some strange experiences when their town is evacuated because of a cloud of toxic waste, an airborne toxic event hovering over it. And this triggers a full-on mortality crisis in the life of Jack, the Adam Driver character. He must now reckon with, among other things, his own mortality, his wife's involvement in very strange drug trials, and possibly his own interest in Hitler. It's a very odd film. Alistair, you've seen it. What did you think of it?
So there's something very compelling about this film, and on paper, again, it could seem as like quite tedious because it's about, I don't know, the intellectual middle class or upper middle class. So in America, the main character is a professor at a college. He's America's foremost expert in Hitler, or leading figure in Hitler studies, as he refers to it as. He's a sort of celebrated lecturer. He lives in a sort of big suburban house with his fourth wife and their 4 children. You know, it's kind of very much a drama about people who've climbed to the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's all very much about this sense of like psychological need for well-being in the main character, his fear of death, his relationship to the people around him. And it could be a quite tedious film that makes you think that, like, God, do these people have anything else to worry about? They've got everything sorted, so now they're worried about death. But it is just completely gripping about this film. You know, I just found myself just enwrapped by it. Like, every line of dialogue, everything. I can imagine a lot of it comes from the novel. I've not read the novel, but a lot of people seem to really like it. I think it's a kind of cultural touchstone for a lot of people, especially Americans, where I assume Don DeLillo has a bigger following. But he is popular here, and probably a lot of it comes from the book. But there is something just completely enrapturing about this film, and it's kind of hard to describe, but I did think it was very good.
Alistair may be wondering if I'm about to come along and massively shit on it. I'm not going to do that. I must admit I did not like it as much as Alistair seems to, though. I thought it was an extremely well-shot movie containing a lot of good actors and interesting concepts and funny one-liners or moments, but also, I don't know, I found its fundamental archness made it quite hard for me to get sucked in that way. And also, predictably, I thought it was at least half an hour longer than it really needed to be. It definitely comes across as what it is, a movie adapted from a certain kind of very self-aware, very irony-heavy novel. Indeed, the literary novel about an academic having a midlife crisis is kind of a massive cliche at this point, although possibly that's part of the irony. Possibly, maybe it was a bit less of a cliche in the 80s, I don't know. But having said all that, it is very interesting. It does touch on a lot of fun concepts. There's a lot of good jokes or good bits that made me laugh from their sheer stupidity. The airborne toxic event sequence is enjoyably manic. I do always enjoy the beat where a serious event is somewhat overtaken by idiots arguing about banality, and there is a lot of that in this film. To the extent that I occasionally wondered if that's the titular white noise, just people yelling about nothing.
Well, again, there's a lot of white noise in this film, I suppose. It never really directly addresses what is the white noise. Possibly the whole thing is white noise. Yeah, it is one of those things like academic in a sort of New England-esque town has midlife crisis. Again, probably maybe less of a cliche when it was written, but again, as I said before, there are no original ideas, there's only original executions. And there is something, the way this is done, the dialogue is very enrapturing. Some of the characters don't really speak like people, but there is a thing where I feel a lot of that is probably lifted direct from the books. There's some bits when actors sort of talk to camera, but not in a sort of, I don't know, House of Cards kind of breaking the fourth wall kind of way. You feel like, are these people talking more to us than to each other? And probably a lot of that is basically they've lifted prose directly from the book to put into the film. But again, it's so well written, you kind of get caught up in it. Again, it's not necessarily believable, but the whole thing is done in this sort of hyper-real, slightly silly way, which, I don't know, sells it.
Yeah, I think the bit I liked the most was probably the last 50 minutes, hour of it, actually. I think the part that is actually labelled Chapter 3 in the film, or Part 3 or whatever, which sort of focuses in a bit more on the relationship between Adam Driver and Greta Gerwig's character, his wife, which maybe toned down some of the more manic other bits and maybe added a few more sincere musings on death and their fear of it and, again, their relationship and what it could or could not withstand. And it was actually weirdly touching. Yeah, quite sweet in an odd, still quite surreal and absurd way. I found, the first hour of it quite hard to pin down, as I say, quite a strange tonal clash between its drama and its intense archness, which made it quite hard to take the drama seriously. But I thought the last hour or so was actually quite sweet in a weird way.
Yeah, it brings all the themes together, the sort of death, drugs, and things like that, all kind of wrap up together into a quite dramatic finale. It's very 80s, I think, as well. It really touched on the 80s. There's a lot about consumerism. Lots of scenes take place in like shopping malls with people buying lots of stuff and like their house is full of like consumer goods and things like that. It's very, very 80s without being like really on the nose about it. They don't have anything like a bit of someone watching a speech by Ronald Reagan talking about morning in America or aspiration. It's not that unsubtle, but it kind of does weave in a lot of stuff. I mean, towards the end, there's a sort of fantasy bit. There's almost like a musical song and dance in the shopping mall, which is, it's very much kind of the characters sort of celebrating the kind of consumerist America, but it's done with such sort of irony that it's sort of subverting that. So it's bringing all these things and again with the rise of like pharmaceuticals and drug trials, and we know how all that's ended up with kind of the opioid crisis, and Americans all over the place just want to getting stoned out of their heads to the point that they're basically killing themselves. So and all that how all that began. So it's got all these like threads running through it that it does weave together into a sort of rich story.
Well, yeah, the sort of drug storyline about, what the Greta Gerwig character is taking starts off at the very beginning, and when that comes to the fore in the final part, that was that was the good bit, because yes, I could get what that was satirising, even with my lack of knowledge of the 80s.
Yeah, and there's lots of like things that it brings together. There's sort of callbacks. It's constantly like a callback and referring to itself. There's a supporting character played by Don Cheadle, who's really into Elvis, obsessed with his academic work on Elvis, the way the main character sort of has the same obsession with Hitler. And there's also a sequence involving someone being shot on the toilet, echoing how Elvis died, things like that. And also, it's funny in a sort of darkly comic way to see someone get shot on the toilet. At the same time, also, it's kind of calling back to itself and the previous references to Elvis. So, I don't know, it's always, I guess, doing something arch, even when it's doing something that's kind of toilet humour.
Yeah, no, I did enjoy the bits where the Don Cheadle character and the Adam Driver character sort of go head to head and get sort of slightly pissy with each other over who's more interesting, Elvis or Hitler. There was sort of these weird fact-offs where they both just shout facts about Elvis and Hitler at each other. Again, that was until I got to the point towards the end when I became a bit more emotionally engaged with it. To be honest, those were the parts I enjoyed most, the sort of absurd comedy.
Yeah, it's funny. That's the thing. It's mainly it's funny, but also I guess there's like they're kind of digging into the themes a bit more again, like death, fame, these sort of things as well. But the kind of the way they kind of do these performative, factful bits when I guess they're trying to doing sort of lectures in a sort of very attention-grabbing way. It's kind of quite silly, which I think some people links back. Some people could be like, why are we supposed to take these ridiculous people who've kind of got all their material and pretty much other needs sorted, but for some reason are on the verge of existential crisis? Why take their drama seriously, when there's so much suffering in the world? But I feel the film, as well as being funny, kind of finds a way to always take you back round to it by finding something compelling to make you engage with. Yeah,
I think there's points of it towards the beginning where the degree to which the film isn't really fully sympathising with the character has become a bit hard to engage with, maybe. Like, until the last hour or so, I really felt like the film was mostly just making fun of Adam Driver.
Yeah, I suppose there's, he loves his family and stuff. This sort of bizarre collection of kids he's cobbled together from his former marriages and his wife's former marriages. And obviously, you get the real sense during the toxic event that he wants to keep them safe and will do anything to keep them safe. I mean, there's some quite, like, almost like scary bits, like, when the kind of lightning is like illuminating the cloud and it looks really ominous and stuff, and there's a very tense bit when they're driving away from the toxic cloud and they have to stop for petrol, and he's just sort of standing out there filling up his car, and then the toxic cloud passes over in front of a big pole with the Shell logo on it in the petrol station. The cloud mixing with the light from this Shell sign just kind of makes it look sort of demonic and evil, almost like the Shell sign kind of almost becomes like the Eye of Sauron, and the dark cloud makes it look kind of like this American suburb look more like Mordor, and like it's very visually arresting, and there's also it's quite dark and quite tense. You feel for these people. You don't want them to die, you don't want them to breathe in this toxic cloud.
I could have taken or left them, but I will admit this is an incredibly well shot movie. It does look lovely.
There's also one other strange thing about it, and I've been thinking about how to put this together, but there's only one way, which is to come out and say it. I'm not really sure why, but the whole thing really reminds me of The Simpsons. And I can't exactly put my finger on it. I don't know if it's because it's like there's the family living in suburbia. Obviously, these are Simpsons supposed to be blue collar. These are upper middle class people. I don't know if it's the fact that the kids are very precocious and kind of talk a lot like adults and are very intelligent. Like, again, Simpsons characters don't always behave like children because they do what they need for Simpsons plots, which are usually quite intelligent. There's a sort of plot line of a loving family that kind of would fall apart over misunderstandings and miscommunications that leads to silliness and an over-the-top comedic set pieces, and then come together in a sort of sweet moment of love and coupley and family understanding at the end. I mean, and also there's like a bizarre bit in the middle of the toxic cloud. I mean, this could have been an episode of The Simpsons.
I mean, you're more of a Simpsons head than I am, but this was, what, a 1985 novel? I suppose it's plausible that Matt Groening had read it.
Yeah, it is a countercultural touch point, I think, in America. I haven't read this book, but, you know, I think it has that kind of status. So it's believed the sort of thing he could have read. And I guess it's probably in the mix of sort of, because he obviously, The Simpsons is very heavily riffing on suburban life, you know, from a lot of American sitcoms like, things like All in the Family and stuff like that. You know, these like 70s and 80s American family sitcoms are mainly what they're riffing off. But, you know, other things are about life in suburban America, which, you know, this novel, I guess, is also about.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was just something about, I don't know, maybe it's the humour, the kind of, I don't know, intelligent wit mixed with some really quite silly bits, things like that. The kind of precocious children. I mean, I thought the teenagers were very good and they came across well. Actually, they kind of got across the fact that actually teenagers are usually cleverer than in real life than depicted in film. They're grown-ups, but who just don't know as much. But they're inquisitive and inquiring about the world. But also the element of they constantly ask their parents for things. They're constantly looking up to their parents and expect their parents to know everything and sort everything out. But at the same time, their parents don't. But also they're sort of rebelling against their parents. There's a kind of, I don't know, I thought they captured teenagehood well in this film.
Yeah, the kids do a good job of having these sort of gentle, distinguishing features. Like, some of them don't get a huge amount to do. Like, I think there's one of the daughters who gets a bigger storyline, and the others are just kind of slightly background characters. But they are well distinguished.
Yeah, I don't know if they thought this would be a prestige film this year. Again, if it's a cult novel that's got a following. Doesn't seem to have had much impact on the Golden Globes that were, you know, announced yesterday, I think. Well, I guess probably late at night on Tuesday in America.
Yeah, no, I think it's probably the sort of film that might have been expected to do well, I guess. It's a literary adaptation. It's got Adam Driver doing a sort of transformative performance, aged up a bit and somewhat resembling Steve Coogan.
Yeah, but I don't think this is going to be one of the big films of the year that everyone's like, technically I think came out last year, but, you know, that everyone's like raving about. But I don't know. It certainly set a bar. You know, I'm excited for the films that are better than it. They'll be the great films of this year.
I think it's a film that's maybe a bit less than the sum of its parts, but it is a very interesting film. I am still glad I saw it, despite my possibly negative sounding tone.
That's all we have time for. If you have enjoyed this episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, then please leave us a review in your podcast provider of choice to help spread the word. You can also visit our website, moderatefantasyviolence.com, to find other episodes of the podcast, bonus audio clips, and short written pieces by Nick and myself.
And also, if you want to follow us on the social media, you can do that on Twitter, assuming it still exists in a week or so when we release this, at MFV Podcast, or on Facebook as Moderate Fantasy Violence. Or if you want to follow me in any capacity, and why wouldn't you, you can find me on Twitter as NickMB, on the general internet at nickbryan.com, and various other platforms under mostly just Nick Bryan. I'm trying to, squat my name where I can. Thank you.
If you want any more from me, I'm on Twitter at AlistairJRBall, and there's more of my writing at redtrainblog.com. Join us next time on the podcast when we will be committing crimes on the high seas in Our Flag Means Death, starring Taika Waititi, and investigating gangland crimes in new comic New Burn from Chip Zdarsky and Jacob Phillips. Join us in 2 weeks to see what we made of those. Until then, have a good one and goodbye.
Bye.
Onto them slow horses.
Slow horses.
Slow horses will drag you away.
I was actually about to do something similar myself, so I'm glad you took the burden of singing off me.
Right, cool. Glad that was on the hot mic.